Winter, 1610. Northern Hungary lay locked in ice. The snow was not deep, but the cold was so severe that the earth itself had hardened like stone. The roads leading into the Transylvanian hills were unnaturally empty. No wagons, no travelers, no human voices. Only the wind sliding through bare forests, carrying with it a nameless sense of unease. In that frozen stillness, a column of soldiers moved slowly up the incline toward Cachtice castle, their shadows stretching long across the gray snow beneath a pale, reluctant moon. At the head of the column rode György Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, a man whose authority stood second only to the king himself. He was not easily shaken. He had seen battlefields soaked in blood, heard bones crack beneath the hooves of horses, grown accustomed to the stench of death and iron after conquest. Yet tonight, standing before the massive stone gates of the castle, Thurzo felt something different. Not the tension of facing an enemy, but the unease of stepping into a place that should not exist. The gates opened with a low groaning protest of ancient wood and rusted metal. There was no greeting, no torchlight, rushing forward as one would expect in a noble residence. Beyond the threshold lay darkness, thick, motionless, unnatural. But what caused the soldiers to hesitate was not the dark itself. It was the smell. It was not the scent of hearth fires, nor wine, nor stored provisions. It was heavier, damp, metallic, a sickening blend of old smoke, cold stone, and something unmistakably ferrous. Soldiers who had stood among corpses on open battlefields recognized it instantly, even if none wished to name it aloud. Blood, old blood, blood that had soaked into walls, floors, and air for so long it could no longer be driven out. Thurzo entered first, one hand resting on his sword's hilt, though he did not draw it. If the accusations were true, steel would be unnecessary. The corridors were long and narrow, their ceilings lower than those of other castles, forcing every footstep to echo nakedly. Weak torches flickered against damp stone walls, their trembling light revealing mold cracks and shadows that clung like living things. They descended deeper, following spiral staircases into the lowest reaches of the fortress. The air grew colder. The stench thickened. One soldier lifted a hand to cover his nose, but Thurzo motioned him onward. In a place like this, shielding one's senses did not banish the horror. It only sharpened the realization that such a thing should never exist inside a human home. The first door opened onto a small chamber without windows, save for a ventilation hole no wider than a hand. In the corner, a young girl was chained to the wall. Rusted iron circled her wrists and ankles so tightly that her skin was bruised and torn beneath the metal. She was still alive, barely so her breathing shallow, her chest rising and falling as if one more breath of cold air might end it. What chilled Thurzo and his men was not the state of her body. It was her eyes. She looked at them but did not see them. No fear, no plea, no hope. It was the gaze of someone who had endured pain for so long that the mind had withdrawn, abandoning the body behind. A living corpse existing only because death had not yet arrived. They found another room, then another, and in a deeper chamber on a rough wooden table lay the body of another young woman. Her skin was pale, stiff with cold, her flesh marked with countless small wounds, as though life itself had been drained from her, slowly, deliberately, with methodical patience. There were no signs of frenzy, no chaos, only precision. The soldiers understood then that this was not the site of a single crime. It was a system, a place where suffering was not accidental, but intentional. And the mind behind it was not a mad creature lurking in shadow, not a beast howling in insanity. Thurzo stopped in the corridor torchlight, carving harsh lines across his face, revealing a gravity rarely seen in the eyes of a man accustomed to command. He had heard the whispers in the village's stories, told so softly they resembled prayers. He had hoped they were exaggerations born of fear. But the stench in the air, the sealed rooms, and those empty eyes spoke a different truth. This was not the lair of a feral predator. This was a castle, a place of power, order, and law. And that made it far more terrifying, because if what they were seeing was real, then the architect of this hell was not hiding in darkness. She was living above them in light, in silk surrounded by reverence. Before there were locked rooms, before chains and hollow eyes lingering in the dark, everything began with a name that, when spoken aloud, made voices drop or fall silent entirely. In 16th century Hungary and Transylvania, there were wealthy families and powerful lineages, but only a few names truly carried fear. Báthory was one of them. In this land, a surname was not merely something to be spoken. It was a declaration, a warning. To say one belonged to the House of Báthory did not mean wealth alone. It meant ownership of vast stretches of land, forests, hills, and scattered villages where generations were born, lived, and died under their rule. It meant private armies, stone castles raised where others dared not settle, and a history long enough that power no longer needed justification. Transylvania, the ancestral homeland of the family, was never a gentle place. Dense forests swallowed sunlight. Morning fog clung to valleys like funeral shrouds, and villagers grew up on stories of demons, wolves, and things that moved unseen beyond the edge of firelight. Here, legends were not entertainment. They were explanations for fear. For generations, the Báthory family ruled this land. They were warlords in times of conflict, cold administrators in times of peace. In the collective memory of the people, the name Báthory stood for both protection and threat. They could save a village from invasion and just as easily erase it for a perceived insult. Their power did not need display. It existed like the ancient stone walls themselves, ever-present, unquestioned, and old beyond memory. Whispers followed the family murmurs of what villagers called wolf blood. It was neither praise nor curse, but something in between. Wolves were admired for their intelligence, their patience, their precision. They did not kill in madness. They killed when necessary, and they never appeared weak. Those who bore the Báthory name were known for sharp minds, innate leadership, and a cruelty kept under firm control. They did not lash out. They calculated. The family's history produced celebrated heroes, but also figures remembered in lowered voices, individuals marked by volatile tempers, cold rages, and punishments no one dared witness. Elizabeth Báthory was born into this atmosphere. From the moment she entered the world, she was not merely a child. She was an inheritance, the embodiment of a bloodline long accustomed to command and obedience. She was the niece of Stephen Báthory, a man who wore the crown of Poland and ruled vast regions of Europe. That connection alone ensured Elizabeth grew up in a world where very few dared tell her no. Yet power does not come only from noble blood or political alliances. It is forged in upbringing. Elizabeth was raised behind thick stone walls, distant from warmth, in a family consumed by power and war. She learned early that emotion was to be hidden, weakness was a flaw, and survival at the summit required viewing others as pieces on a board. In the grand halls of the Báthory estates, no child was held simply because they were afraid. No one soothed nightmares. Children were taught to observe, to remember, and to control themselves from an early age. Elizabeth learned faster than most. She was intelligent, sharp, and possessed an extraordinary memory. But alongside that brilliance grew a silence, an emptiness that no lesson addressed. Servants noticed early that her gaze was different. Elizabeth did not look at them as equals, but as elements of the space she occupied, as objects, as tools. This was not cruelty openly expressed, but a complete absence of what might be called empathy. A child raised in absolute power rarely learns how to imagine another's suffering. In later retellings, people would say the Báthory bloodline produced both geniuses and monsters, and that sometimes the two lived within the same person. Elizabeth was the most terrifying proof of that belief. She was more intelligent, better educated, and more powerful than almost everyone around her. But no one taught her how to love. No one taught her that power had limits. As Elizabeth grew, the name Báthory did more than shield her from consequences. It built an invisible wall between her and the world of ordinary people. Mistakes could be erased. complaints could be silenced. And in such a world, the boundary between what was permitted and what was forbidden slowly dissolved. She was not born to be loved. She was born to be feared. And within that fear, the seed of a far greater tragedy was quietly taking root, waiting for the day it would grow large enough to break through every stone wall that once protected it. Elizabeth Báthory grew up surrounded by silk, but it was not the soft silk of loving arms. It was heavy, thick fabric draped against cold stone walls to soften the naked face of power. Her childhood knew no laughter echoing across courtyards, no barefoot afternoons running through wet grass. Instead, there were endless corridors where the footsteps of a child rang too clearly, as if the vastness itself was not meant for someone so small. Within the castles of the Báthory family, children were not indulged. They were observed, evaluated, and shaped into something worthy of the blood they carried. Elizabeth was taught to read and write at an early age, introduced to languages many adults would never learn, and spoken to about politics, war, and power long before she could fully grasp the weight of those words. Knowledge came to her as a command, not a gift. No one asked Elizabeth how she felt. No one paused to consider whether a child was tired or afraid. In that world, gentleness was seen as a dangerous weakness. Discipline was a necessity. And Elizabeth learned quickly how to conceal emotion, how to hold her face still, even as chaos stirred beneath the surface where no one else could see. From an early age, her body betrayed her. Seizures came without warning, throwing her onto cold stone floors under the confused gaze of servants. Limbs stiffened, breath-fractured, eyes rolled back as though the soul itself had been dragged from her body. In a world steeped in superstition, this was not called illness. It was whispered about in darker terms. Possession, curse, the wolf's blood demands its price. Those whispers were never spoken to Elizabeth directly, but she heard them. Children in castles always hear more than adults realize. She learned that even with the most powerful bloodline, she could still become something feared differently, not for authority, but for abnormality. And in a family where image and reputation were everything, abnormality was a threat. Instead of comfort, Elizabeth was isolated. During her episodes, she was taken to private rooms, kept away from guests and relatives. Isolation became familiar. A brilliant child left alone with her thoughts in rooms so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. There was no one to share fear with, and no one to teach her how to recognize fear in others. Elizabeth learned to observe people as phenomena. She watched servants lower their heads, saw their eyes avert as they passed her, heard their voices soften when the name Báthory was spoken. She realized early that people reacted to her not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. That realization carved a cold emptiness into her view of the world. While other children learned to play, Elizabeth learned to control. She discovered that a single cold stare, a prolonged silence, could unsettle grown adults. She began to understand that silence could be more frightening than shouting. And she liked that feeling, not because it hurt others, but because it gave her what her childhood lacked most: safety through control. The seizures eventually grew less frequent, or at least less discussed, but their imprint remained. Elizabeth grew up knowing her own body could betray her at any moment, and this knowledge fed an obsession with controlling everything else around her. People often fear what they cannot control, and when that fear grows quietly, it can transform into something dangerous. She did not cry when others were in pain, not because she was cruel from the beginning, but because she was never taught that another person's suffering required anything beyond observation. To Elizabeth, people slowly became moving shapes within her space, present yet never truly reaching her. That childhood passed among cold stone and rigid ritual knowledge and isolation. There was no single moment of transformation, no great collapse. Only a slow process in which a child grows up without learning how to play, how to share, or how to love. And in the long corridors of Báthory castles, as those small footsteps gradually became steadier and more assured, No one noticed that silence had lingered for too long, and that it was beginning to learn how to answer in ways the world would one day be forced to hear. Elizabeth Báthory did not enter marriage for love. In her world, marriage was never a private story. It was an arrangement, a calculated fusion of power, like forging two pieces of steel into a sharper blade. While Elizabeth was still very young, her fate had already been sealed, not through gentle whispers, but through cold conversations between men who ruled. The man chosen for her carried a name that commanded attention across the kingdom, Ferenc Nadasti. In tavern songs and battlefield tales, he was called the Black Knight of Hungary, not because of the color of his armor, but because of how he left the battlefield, always wrapped in the shadow of death. Ferenc was not known for mercy. He was known for efficiency. In the southern lands where Ottoman forces pressed relentlessly against the borders, the name Nadasti became synonymous with battles that ended in blood and the long silence that followed. The marriage of Elizabeth Báthory and Ferenc Nadasti united two bloodlines accustomed to war in different forms. One was conquered openly on the battlefield. The other had grown within stone walls, where power was enforced through command and gaze. When the wedding ended with all the necessary ceremony and display, Ferenc departed quickly. War awaited him, and Elizabeth, still very young, remained behind in the vast castle, now bearing a new title, the wife of a living legend. Ferenc Nadasti was almost never home. He belonged to fields soaked in mud and blood, where the clash of metal drowned out human voices. The early years of the marriage passed in prolonged absence. Elizabeth learned to live with it, or more precisely, she learned to rule within it. With her husband always away, authority within the castle fell into her hands, not gradually, but completely. By day, the castle became a machine operating under Elizabeth's command. Servants lined up, awaiting instruction. Ledgers were brought for her signature. Minor disputes from the surrounding villages were placed before her judgment. Elizabeth did not hesitate. She did not seek consensus. She issued orders, and those around her quickly understood that this young lady of the castle was no pale shadow of the Black Knight. She possessed her own method of ensuring obedience. By night, as torches dimmed and the castle sank into silence, Elizabeth remained alone with stone walls and her thoughts. That was when letters from the battlefield arrived. They were not the love letters one might imagine. Thick paper, rigid handwriting, the faint scent of smoke and metal. Ferenc did not write of longing. He wrote of engagements, of breaking enemy formations, of how fear could be planted before death arrived. Elizabeth read every line with care, not with horror, but with the focus of someone learning. Those letters did not teach her how to kill with a sword or spear, but they taught her something else. Violence, when applied, systematically creates order. Ferenc killed enemies to protect the borders. Elizabeth began to understand that within her own castle, she too would need tools to protect her authority. She observed how servants reacted to punishment. She realized fear held more power than a lengthy explanation. A public correction carried out slowly and deliberately spread more effectively than any speech. Elizabeth did not see this as cruelty. In her mind, it was discipline, the only way to keep everything within control, just as armies on the battlefield must obey or collapse. While Ferenc killed men far away, Elizabeth learned how to punish those nearby. Not with a blade, but with absolute authority within a closed space. She did not need to raise her voice. Her prolonged silence was sometimes more frightening than rage. Servants began to avoid her gaze. Lower their voices, walk more softly through the corridors, as if afraid of disturbing something dormant, something that might awaken at any moment. This parallel existence lasted for years. A husband became a symbol of sanctioned violence beyond the walls. A wife became the center of unquestioned power within them. No one saw the dangerous connection forming. No one questioned a young woman ruling through fear, because in that world, fear was still considered a legitimate tool. The letters continued to arrive, victories recorded, deaths reduced to numbers. Each time Elizabeth finished reading, she folded the paper carefully, set it aside, and looked around her castle. There were no battlefields here, no foreign enemies, but there were people, and people she began to believe required control just as much as any army. Elsewhere, he killed the enemy. Here, she learned how to punish. By day, Cachtice Castle resembled any other noble seat of power in Hungary. The great doors opened and closed without pause, people coming and going in a steady flow. Servants moved according to a rigid order. Heads lowered steps, quick and precise. Stewards presented ledgers, village elders came to report, soldiers stood guard with polished spears, catching the light. Elizabeth Báthory sat at the highest position, listening, deciding, ending every matter with brief sentences that allowed no argument. Power was visible there, tangible like armor wrapped tightly around her. But when the sun sank behind the hills and the last light withdrew from the tall windows, the castle began to change. Doors slowly closed. Voices faded. Servants retreated to their quarters, leaving the long corridors empty. Torches were lit, their weak yellow flames trembling, casting distorted shadows that crawled along the stone walls. Cachtice was no longer a court. It became a massive block of stone filled with absence. Elizabeth rarely slept early. At night, when there was no one left to command, she began to walk. Her footsteps echoed across the stone floors, slow and measured, as though the castle itself were keeping time with her. Each corridor acted as a hollow conduit, returning the sound of her own steps with a cold delay. There was no reply, no other presence, only her and the walls that had stood for centuries. In those hours, power ceased to be a shield. It became invisible. Elizabeth owned everything within her sight, yet had no one with whom to share the silence. By day, she could command hundreds. By night, no order could make the castle feel less empty. Solitude revealed itself most clearly when there was no one left to rule. The grand rooms, dressed in thick tapestries and heavy furniture, felt too vast for a single figure. High ceilings swallowed sound before it could return. Elizabeth realized that even standing at the center of power, she remained a small, isolated point within the space she controlled. That realization did not bring humility. It brought irritation. She began to notice details that daylight never revealed. A door not fully closed. A corridor is rarely used. A room at the end of a spiral stair where torchlight never fully reached. At night, the castle seemed to expose deeper layers of itself. And Elizabeth, trained from childhood to observe, was drawn to those darker spaces. Extended silence uncovered thoughts that had no place during the day. She thought of the letters from the battlefield, of the way Ference described controlling soldiers and enemies alike. She thought of fear and how fear made people more predictable, more pliable. In darkness, these ideas were no longer softened by ritual or responsibility. They sharpened. Elizabeth did not feel happy, nor was she truly miserable. It was another state, entirely a cold void, where emotions did not erupt but settled into a thin layer of ice. She began to understand that power did not bring fulfillment. It only brought the silence of others. And when everyone fell silent, the only thing left was oneself. Those long nights formed a new rhythm. The day was ordered. Night was contemplation. The day was marked by the lowered gaze of others. Night was her own reflection in darkened glass. Elizabeth spent more time alone, and the more alone she became, the further she drifted from the world around her. People turned into moving components of a system. She managed nothing more. There were moments when she stopped in an empty corridor and stood still for a long time, listening to the castle's silence, not searching for anything specific, but as if waiting for an answer. Cachtice did not respond. It simply remained heavy cold, like a vast mirror reflecting the emptiness growing within its mistress. Power had given Elizabeth everything a woman of her time could dream of: land, title, unquestioned obedience. Yet in the darkness, when the lights faded and her footsteps echoed alone, she began to feel the limits of all of it. No crown was heavy enough to fill a void formed by prolonged solitude, and on those nights when the castle seemed to breathe with her, Elizabeth Báthory continued walking through its long corridors, carrying her power like a thick cloak, too heavy to discard, too thin to warm her, and not enough to keep the emptiness from quietly expanding in the dark. The news arrived on a cold morning in the way the most important messages often traveled within the noble world, brief, precise, and allowing no misunderstanding. Ferenc Nadasti was dead, not by a sword on the battlefield, not by a stray shot, but by sudden illness in a military camp. The Black Knight of Hungary, who had walked away from countless battles without hesitation, fell inside a tent far from his castle, far from his family, far from any ritual of glory. Elizabeth received the news in the great hall where daily affairs continued as usual. There was no cry of shock, no collapse. She stood still, listening to every word as it was read aloud, her expression unchanged. Those around her waited for a reaction, a sign of grief, or at least disbelief. But Elizabeth merely nodded, signaling that she had understood, and dismissed them all. When the doors closed, the vast hall fell empty. Morning light poured through the tall windows, spreading across the cold stone floor. Elizabeth stood there alone for a long time. She did not think of Ferenc as a husband in the conventional sense. He had been a distant shadow, a name tied to war and absence. But he had also been a counterweight, an invisible limit, a presence that even when absent, kept Elizabeth's world within a familiar order. Ferenc's death did not leave behind the emotional void people expected. It created something else, deeper, harder to name. As a widow, Elizabeth inherited not only wealth and land, but also the full extent of Ferenc's authority. Other castles, other territories, other lives now fell under her control. There was no equal left standing, no one with the power to command her or even to argue. Freedom arrived in the quietest possible way. There was no proclamation, no moment of celebration, only the gradual realization that there was no longer anyone to wait for. No more letters from the battlefield, no distant news carrying the scent of smoke and metal. Everything became still, uncomfortably so. In the months following Ferenc's death, Elizabeth did exactly what society expected. She wore mourning black. She reduced her public appearances. She allowed others to believe she was grieving. And in some measure, she was. But it was not the loss of love. It was the loss of structure. The loss of a rhythm shaped by absence and anticipation. As time passed, grief did not deepen. It faded. And in the space it left behind, something else began to take shape. Something Elizabeth had never confronted directly before. Boredom. Not the boredom of leisure, but the suffocating stagnation of a mind accustomed to operating at full intensity, now deprived of challenge. Absolute power, once stripped of opposition, revealed its most dangerous side. Problems that once demanded focus became trivial. Ledgers repeated themselves. Minor disputes were settled with a single sentence. The people around her offered no intellectual resistance. They bowed too quickly, agreed too easily. Elizabeth realized she stood at the peak of a very small mountain, and there was no one to speak with, no one to challenge her, no one to resist. The long nights in the castle grew heavier. The silence that once served as background now became the dominant presence. She began spending more time alone, not because of sorrow, but because there was nothing else to occupy her. Familiar corridors repeated themselves into meaninglessness. Vast rooms no longer conveyed power, only emptiness. Elizabeth looked upon the world she controlled and realized it had grown too small for the demands of her mind. No one around her dared to say it aloud, but that silence was the most dangerous thing of all. With no pressure from outside, all energy turned inward. And inside Elizabeth, there were too many things that had never been named: an obsession with control, a fear of losing power, and an emotional void concealed for far too long. Ferenc's death did not create a fragile widow. It released a dragon from a chain that had always been long but never fully broken. There was no longer a war to project violence outward, no towering shadow to share authority. Elizabeth now stood as the absolute center of her world, and in the stillness that followed morning as the final rituals ended and the castle returned to routine, a truth slowly emerged, cold and undeniable. What was growing within Elizabeth was not hatred, not grief, it was emptiness. After the death of Ferenc Nadasti, Elizabeth Báthory's world did not collapse. It shrank. What had once been filled with waiting with news from distant battlefields, with the rhythm of a strange marriage, now vanished, exposing a raw and unguarded void. Within that void, Elizabeth began to notice something she had never had time to face before her own body. She did not age suddenly. There was no single moment marking a clear transition. Only mornings that lingered a little longer before she rose. Evenings when candlelight no longer seemed quite bright enough. And then moments when she paused for too long before the polished glass hanging in her private chamber. At first, there was no scrutiny. It was a habit, but the habit slowly carried discomfort with it. Elizabeth began to see things that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there unnoticed. Skin at the neck no longer held the same tension. A faint shadow formed beneath the eyes when light struck at an angle. Signs so subtle that no one else in the castle would have noticed. But Elizabeth did. In her world, beauty had never been an abstract concept. It was bound to power, to the ability to silence others through presence alone. A woman bearing the name Báthory was expected to embody superiority, not only of blood, but of image. Elizabeth had been raised to believe perfection was a state to be maintained, not something permitted to fade. And now that fading, however slow, had begun, Elizabeth spoke of it to no one. She did not complain or inquire. Servants only noticed their mistress had become unnervingly precise. Light in the chamber had to be positioned exactly. Hair was brushed again if it lay even slightly out of place. Clothing was changed multiple times before Elizabeth was satisfied. Not from vanity, but from a growing urgency to control. She began to read more, not books of estate management or politics, but older manuscripts, medical writings where early knowledge blurred into superstition. Pages that spoke of balance within the body, of vitality, of how youth abandoned a person one fraction at a time. And throughout these texts, blood appeared as a central element, both scientific and symbolic. Blood carried life. Blood carried lineage. Blood determined strength. Elizabeth did not see this as new thinking. She had been taught since childhood that Báthory blood was different. But now, as she observed changes within herself, that belief shifted direction. If blood sustained life and power was there, a way to preserve that strength longer, not through magic, but through a deeper understanding of its nature. These thoughts did not arrive in a rush. They seeped in slowly like water into stone. Elizabeth did not believe she was straying. On the contrary, she felt she was doing what was necessary. Just as a ruler must use every means to maintain order, a woman of power must protect herself against decline. She spent more time alone, not in corridors, but in her private rooms. That space became where Elizabeth confronted thoughts she could not voice. There were no subjects to command, no equals to challenge her. Only time, slow, unyielding, and impossible to negotiate with. Elizabeth did not fear death. She never had, but she began to fear something else, the loss of influence. The moment when her gaze would no longer lower voices. The day when her authority would exist only on paper, no longer reflected in her body. Old stories within the castle resurfaced not in the great hall, but in hushed conversations about herbs, folk remedies, methods of preserving vitality that science had yet to name. Elizabeth did not encourage them, but she did not forbid them either. She listened, remembered, discarded what felt useless, retained what hinted at possibility. The mirror remained, but it was no longer the center of the room. The center was now Elizabeth herself, armed with cold clarity and an unease that was being rationalized day by day. She did not look into the glass for reassurance. She looked to observe, to measure, to detect changes before they slip beyond control. No rituals had yet begun. No boundaries had been crossed. But in the stillness following morning, something had changed irreversibly. Elizabeth Báthory no longer accepted time as an untouchable law. And when someone who once controlled vast lands begins to believe that everything can be managed, that belief itself becomes the first true sign of tragedy. That afternoon unfolded like hundreds of other afternoons in Cachtice Castle. The dim winter light slid across thick stone walls, never warm enough to chase the cold that seeped into the air. Elizabeth sat in her private chamber before the dressing table, while a young maid stood behind her brushing her hair. The girl worked carefully, head bowed low, trying to keep her hands from trembling. Serving Lady Báthory was always a trial, not because she shouted, but because she could remain silent for too long. No one knew exactly what caused it. Perhaps fatigue. Perhaps a knot in the hair was not loosened quickly enough. Or perhaps a single fleeting lapse of attention. The comb caught, pulled harder than intended. A sharp pain shot across Elizabeth's scalp, sudden and precise, like a needle driven straight into thoughts already stretched thin. Everything happened in an instant. Elizabeth turned fast and reflexive without thought. Her hand swung up and struck the maid's face with more force than any punishment that had ever been delivered in this room before. The sound was dry and brief, swallowed immediately by the stone walls. The girl stumbled a sharp breath, escaping her half pain, half fear. There was no scream, no shouted rebuke, only an abrupt silence that filled the room. The maid froze, one hand pressed to her cheek, eyes wide, not daring to cry. Elizabeth stood still, her breathing steady. The anger had not exploded. It had already passed as quickly as it had arrived. Then Elizabeth looked down at her hand. A few small droplets of blood had splashed onto the back of it, dark red against pale skin. Not much, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to draw the eye. Elizabeth did not pull her hand away at once. She stared at the blood as though it had appeared from somewhere else, unrelated to the blow that had just been struck. The maid trembled and stepped back, stammering an apology. Her words sounded distant, as if Elizabeth were hearing them from the far end of a very long corridor. In that moment, Elizabeth was no longer focused on the person before her. Her attention narrowed onto a strange sensation rising within her. Not remorse, not satisfied, but a sharp, lucid awareness, like the moment when an idea suddenly clicks into place. Elizabeth took a piece of silk and gently wiped her hand. When the fabric touched her skin, she paused. Slanted light from the window fell across the spot she had just cleaned, reflecting faintly. It could have been an illusion. It could have been light alone, but Elizabeth thought the skin there looked different, slightly brighter, slightly smoother, very subtle, almost insignificant, but enough to make her stop. She raised her hand closer, turning her wrist, observing. There was no miracle, no visible transformation, but the thought had appeared, and once born, it did not easily fade. In Elizabeth's mind, fragments gathered from many years began to draw together. Blood was vitality. Youth was bound to the life force, and life force, if properly understood, could perhaps be preserved. Elizabeth lifted her gaze and looked directly at the maid bent before her. The girl was no longer an individual. In that moment, she was living evidence for a hypothesis just taking shape. Elizabeth said nothing more. She motioned for the girl to leave. There was no further punishment, no extended warning. The maid nearly fled the room, carrying with her a fear she had not yet learned how to name. When the door closed, Elizabeth was alone. She sat down and looked at her hand, now free of blood. The strike had not been deliberate. It had not been planned, but that very randomness made it dangerous. Elizabeth did not feel she had crossed a moral boundary. In her mind, it had been discipline, a reasonable response to carelessness. Yet beneath that, a fragile belief had been planted that there might exist a connection between another's pain and her own sense of control. Not pleasure, not gratification, but certainty. A feeling that the world, for a brief moment, had operated according to her will. Elizabeth did not speak of the incident to anyone. She made no record. She sought no confirmation. But from that day on, the minor punishments within the castle began to change in tone. They were still called discipline, still considered necessary. Only now they were carried out more slowly, more deliberately, as if Elizabeth were watching, noting, learning. The first slap killed no one. It left no corpse. It did not shake the castle, but it left behind something far more dangerous, an idea that power could reach further than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. And like the most terrifying ideas in history, it did not arrive with a roar or a flood of blood. It arrived very softly. After the first slap, Cachtice Castle did not change on the surface. Daytime still followed familiar rituals, lines of bowed heads, decisions delivered in calm voices, order maintained without disruption. But beneath that visible layer, in places untouched by the light of the Great Hall, another order began to take shape. It did not arrive through public decrees. It was built from small repeated choices, discreet enough that no one dared to name them. Elizabeth did not seek accomplices. She observed. Among the servants around her, some were more suitable than others. Not because they were cruel, but because they knew how to remain silent. An older woman familiar with folk remedies and ancient whispers was assigned to attend to private matters. She asked no questions, only nodded as if everything had been decided long before. Another, once a nursemaid, carried the blind loyalty of someone who believed duty stood above morality. To her, Elizabeth was still the child she had cared for, and every request was justified by old affection. And then there was a man, quiet, strong, accustomed to following orders without needing to understand them. In this nocturnal court, each role was clear, requiring no explanation. What had once happened by chance began to be arranged. Spaces were chosen carefully, far from main corridors, where sound might travel. Time was shaped as well, not during the day when everything was crowded, but late at night when the castle slipped into a half-sleep. No one called it a ritual, yet everything repeated itself in the same sequence, consistent enough to provide a sense of security for those involved. Elizabeth did not participate directly. She remained at a distance, close enough to observe, yet removed enough to avoid involvement. Her gaze did not seek pain, nor did it avert itself. It was the gaze of someone watching an experiment proceed according to protocol. Every detail was noted, the way people reacted, the way silence shifted when fear appeared. There were no outbursts of rage, only cold attention. These acts were still called discipline. No other term was acknowledged. To Elizabeth, this was the only way to maintain order in a world where she believed only order could prevent decay. Servants disappeared for a time, and then returned or did not, but the explanations were always vague enough to discourage inquiry. Illness, transfer elsewhere. Serious misconduct, repeated often enough. These reasons hardened into routine. The court in the shadows required no recognition. It survived on fear and convenience. Everyone involved understood that their safety depended on silence, and Elizabeth, at the center of the system, did not need to threaten. Her presence alone reminded them there was no retreat. The most disturbing part was how evil became organized. No longer impulsive reactions, no longer accidental excesses. Everything was planned just enough to avoid notice. Doors locked at precise moments, hours chosen so no one would pass by. Those brought in were always the ones easiest to lose. In this world, people were reduced to variables, and Elizabeth was the one adjusting the equation. She did not feel she was doing anything unusual. On the contrary, she believed she was refining the role of a ruler. Every system requires unseen components to function smoothly, and if those components had to be built in darkness, that was simply the price of order. Elizabeth did not ask where the boundary lay. She asked only whether the system worked. Servants began to understand that the castle's nights were not meant for everyone. Certain corridors were avoided. Certain doors were never opened without permission. Fear spread not through screams, but through absences, empty beds, seats no longer occupied. Each absence served as a reminder that needed no words. Elizabeth continued to observe. There was no excitement, no sign of pleasure, only the sense that everything was settling into the order she had envisioned. Boredom, her most dangerous enemy, temporarily receded. In its place emerged a new rhythm, where every detail carried meaning, where power was not merely displayed, but operated. The audience of the daytime court had no idea another court existed in parallel, a court without throne or ceremony, requiring only absolute silence. And at its center, Elizabeth Báthory was no longer reacting to the world around her. She was designing it. Evil, once arranged into a process, no longer announces itself loudly. It becomes efficient, and it is that efficiency that makes it more terrifying than any sudden act of violence. They were not born in stone-floored rooms, nor did they grow up beneath the yellow candlelight of castles. Their lives began lower, closer to the ground. Small villages pressed against the edges of forests, where mornings started with the crowing of roosters and ended with the smell of cooking smoke clinging to clothing. These girls had names, but their names were spoken only within narrow circles, within families, within villages, within the memories of a few loved ones. Beyond those small worlds, they were almost invisible. One girl rose before dawn to draw water from the well, hands accustomed to cold feet familiar with uneven dirt paths. Another sat mending an old dress, thinking of the coming winter and wondering whether this year's harvest would be enough. They spoke of small things, an untimely rain, a sick cow, a vague promise of work as a servant in the castle. To them that promise sounded like an escape. Cachtice Castle appeared from afar as a massive block of stone on the hill. To villagers, it symbolized power and protection, a place of those who could grant favor, who could offer help. When rumors spread that the lady of the castle was seeking new servants, many families saw a rare opportunity. One less mouth to feed at home. A coin that might be sent back. No one thought of danger. No one dared to think of danger. The girls left their villages carrying small bundles. They looked back at low rooftops, waved farewell to loved ones, and carried with them a mixture of fear and hope. The road up the hill was long and steep, but each step felt closer to something promised to be better. When the castle gates closed behind them, the heavy sound lingered only briefly, then vanished as though it had never existed. In the villages, life continued. An empty bed did not draw attention at first. People said the girl had gone to work far away, that she would send word once she settled in. Time passed. No letters came. Families comforted themselves with simple explanations. The road was difficult. The mistress was busy. Then another girl left the village, and then another. Each time worry was pushed aside by the urgency of daily survival. No screams carried down from the high hill. Forest and cold stone swallowed all sound. What remained was absence, an absence that did not shock but accumulated. An empty chair at the table. A task is divided among those left behind, a question left unasked for fear of the answer. Elizabeth did not know their names, or if she did not remember them. Within the system that had taken shape, names were unnecessary. What mattered was that the disappearance occurred smoothly, without disruption. To her, these girls were small components within a larger mechanism. They came from places without voices, and their silence did not disturb the daytime court. In the villages, people began to whisper, not in words, but in glances, in hands pulling daughters closer when strangers passed, in eyes that avoided the hill when dusk fell. Fear had no clear shape, but it existed, spreading slowly like morning frost. Someone dared to ask, a single question posed softly with respect. The answer was just as soft. The girl had been transferred elsewhere. She had fallen ill. She was unsuited for the work. The explanations were sufficient to end the conversation. No one wanted to ask again. No one wanted to become a problem. These girls had no names in the chronicles. They left no marks on paper. Only memories remained held by those who once held their hands, once spoke their names on quiet afternoons. When those memories lost their keepers, they faded, and with them, the girl's existence disappeared from the world beyond the stone walls. The castle remained silent, imposing. By day, it continued as a place of legitimate power. By night, it consumed stories that would never be told. The girls did not die in the eyes of the world. They simply vanished. And in a society where silence was the price of survival, disappearance was enough to end all questions. No one recorded their names. No one raised markers for them. Only the small villages endured carrying an unspoken fear, a fear that safety could be taken at any moment and that no one held the power to demand it back. Who hears the screams when no one dares to listen? Time passed, and the system in the shadows began to function with a smoothness that was terrifying. Sealed rooms, chosen hours, people who vanished without leaving an echo. Yet for Elizabeth Báthory, that efficiency did not bring the sense of completion she had expected. What she sought was not the act itself, but the result. And that result, promised in her earliest assumptions, never arrived. Elizabeth observed her own body with the cold focus of someone taking inventory. The signs of time were still there. They did not disappear. They did not stop. Every attempt to preserve a sense of control proved temporary. That truth did not make her retreat. It irritated her. And when someone accustomed to victory confronts failure, the instinct is rarely to stop it, it's to change strategy. In rare conversations whispered enough to avoid becoming confession, a notion began to surface. The blood of village girls, it was said, carried the weight of soil and scarcity. It bore the marks of hard labor, hunger, and lives worn down too early. Elizabeth did not voice her thoughts, but she listened. And in her mind, a new boundary took shape. If blood were vitality, if vitality determined strength, then not all vitality could be equal. Noble blood, nourished by good food, education, and the shelter of power, had to be different, purer, stronger. The idea did not erupt suddenly. It formed, slowly built upon old beliefs about lineage and status that Elizabeth had absorbed since childhood as unquestioned truth. This shift carried a danger Elizabeth understood well. Village girls could disappear without causing upheaval. But if the subjects changed, silence would be harder to maintain. She weighed this not with fear, but calculation. A new plan would require greater refinement, less blunt force, and above all, legitimacy. The idea emerged in a setting entirely ordinary, as so many dangerous ideas do. A complaint about the lack of proper education among young noblewomen, a discussion about preparation for marriage etiquette, conduct courtly behavior. Elizabeth listened and recognized an opportunity, a perfect cover, a reason no one could openly oppose. A school, not a school in the modern sense, but a place of instruction. A small academy within the castle where young noblewomen could be sent to learn how to become proper ladies, how to walk, how to speak, how to pray. When spoken aloud, the idea carried dignity and respectability. It appealed directly to lesser noble families, those with names but little influence. To be connected to the name Báthory was an honor. Elizabeth presented the proposal with absolute calm. No urgency, no extravagant promises, just a reasonable suggestion entirely appropriate for the social order of the time. The response came exactly as she had anticipated. Nods of approval, letters of gratitude. Families are willing to send their daughters up the hill, believing it to be the first step toward a better future. The perfection of the trap lay in the fact that it did not resemble one. There was no coercion, no crude deception. Everything unfolded in daylight, with society's knowledge and consent. Carriages carried young noblewomen to the castle, amid polite greetings. Blessings were exchanged. No one saw anything amiss. For Elizabeth, this was more than escalation. It was a declaration, a confirmation that she no longer feared discovery. Her arrogance did not stem from momentary intoxication with power, but from the belief that she had found the flawless method of concealment. She believed she stood above the law, not by defying it, but by using it. The noble girls entered the castle bearing names carefully recorded, names with weight, and that very weight made everything more dangerous. Elizabeth understood the risk, but she also believed the risk itself proved the sophistication of the plan. Only those with sufficient power dared play such a game. In the early days, everything followed the script: lessons, shared meals, strict but reasonable instructions. The surface of the castle remained immaculate, but behind familiar doors, the court in the shadows continued its work now with new subjects. Elizabeth observed with the same cold gaze as before, unmoved, unshaken. What she did not recognize or refuse to acknowledge was that this shift introduced something that had not existed before: attention. When village girls vanished, the world remained silent. When noble daughters failed to write home, silence grew heavy, but by then, Elizabeth no longer listened for warning signs. Her arrogance had reached its peak, and her belief in her own invulnerability obscured every danger. When blood was no longer enough, Elizabeth did not stop. She upgraded, and in that decision, she laid the first stone for the inevitable collapse of her own creation. At first, it was only a delay. A noble family sent a letter inquiring about their daughter studying at Cachtice castle and received a courteous but vague reply. The girl was well. Her lessons were demanding. Winter weather made correspondence difficult. There was nothing unusual in those lines, at least not when read in isolation. Then came another letter from a family farther away, and then another. Letters were sent, but replies arrived more slowly than expected. When they did arrive, they were disturbingly similar. The same reassuring tone, the same avoidance of detail, the same promise that news would follow soon. Fathers and mothers read them again and again, sensing that something was wrong, but not yet able to name it. Suspicion did not erupt in a single day. It accumulated. A father happened to meet another at a modest gathering, where wine was poured, and conversation drifted from politics to family, as it often did. They spoke of their children, and then almost naturally both realized their daughters were in the same place, the same academy, the same prolonged silence. They compared letters, different paper, different seals, but the wording was nearly identical. The explanations matched too perfectly, as if copied from a single template. No one dared voice the thought forming in their minds, but when coincidence repeated itself often enough, it ceased to be a coincidence. One family chose to write more directly with a firmer tone. They requested to see their daughter, or at the very least, to receive a letter written in her own hand. This time the response arrived more quickly, but it was shorter. Their daughter was ill. She was unable to write. A visit would be arranged when her health allowed. The explanation sounded reasonable, and it was precisely that reasonableness that made it suspect. The unanswered letters began to weave a web of silence. Each family believed itself to be an isolated case. No one wished to become troublesome, especially when the name Báthory stood at the beginning of every story. That family was not merely powerful. They were part of the order itself, and to challenge order was to place oneself in danger. But eventually silence crossed a threshold. One father received no reply for weeks. One mother sent 3 letters in succession without a response. The reassurances stopped coming, and when reassurance vanished, fear took its place. They began asking small questions in small places, of a familiar priest, of a local official. No one had clear answers. What they received instead were averted gazes and advice to remain patient. But patience, when stretched too far, turns into suspicion, and suspicion, once shared, becomes accusation. Letters were laid side by side on tables like mute evidence, matching dates, identical explanations, names that disappeared from family correspondence without a satisfactory reason. The disturbing pattern could no longer be ignored. Those who once believed silence was the safest choice began to understand that silence itself was consuming their children. Rumors spread beyond the family circle. They traveled through quiet dinners and discreet meetings. People spoke softly but often. At first, questions. Have you received a letter? Then observations. The replies are the same. And finally, the heaviest whisper of all. Something is very wrong. Elizabeth Báthory continued to appear by day as she always had. The castle doors remained open to guests. There were no signs of panic, but beyond the walls another current had formed. The unanswered letters became the first evidence not of crime but of concealment. And concealment, in a world governed by power, always attracts the attention of other powers. Some families decided to go further. They submitted formal petitions, not naming crimes, only requesting an investigation. Taken alone, such petitions could be buried. But when they arrived together, bearing the same concern, they demanded to be read. From whispers, the matter became a file. From a file, it began finding its way to those who could not ignore it. The terrifying coincidence was no longer a private matter. It became a question of social order. Those who had hesitated out of fear of the Báthory name began to realize that if no one acted, that name would continue to cover everything. And in that moment, the world outside Cachtice Castle began to move in a direction Elizabeth no longer controlled. Letters continued to be sent, but now every unanswered letter was no longer the worry of a single family. It was a knock growing louder against the wall of silence the court in the shadows had built. And when enough knocks strike at once, no wall can stand forever. The petitions did not arrive all at once, but they arrived close enough together that they could not be dismissed as a coincidence. They landed on the desks of those charged with responsibility, each carrying the same concern expressed in the careful language of the nobility. No direct accusations, no named crimes, only questions about prolonged silence and daughters who no longer replied. At the upper levels of power, everyone understood what this meant. When even the most patient families began to write, patience had run out. The name spoken was not Elizabeth Báthory, not yet, but everyone knew where the center of the story lay. And when that center was too dangerous to confront directly, a hand strong enough to reach it without shattering the entire order was required. That hand belonged to Georgi Thurzo. Thurzo was not an impulsive hunter. He was the Palatine of Hungary, second only to the king in authority and obligation, a statesman, a supreme judge, and a man who understood the value of silence better than most. Ironically, he was also related by blood to the Báthory family. That made him the only viable choice and the most dangerous one. Any action he took could be interpreted as favoritism or betrayal. The dilemma was clear. If he ignored the petitions, he allowed unrest to spread among the nobility, threatening confidence in the social order. If he launched a public investigation, he risked plunging the kingdom into scandal by dragging one of its most powerful families into the light. There was no safe option, so Thurzo chose a third path: silence, but not inaction. The investigation began without proclamation. No grand entourage, no public decree. Thurzo dispatched only those he trusted most, disguised as merchants, clerics, travelers. They did not arrive to interrogate. They arrived to listen, and at first what they heard were only fragments of fear. In the villages surrounding Cachtice, stories were not told in sequence. They emerged through implication, through glances, through unnatural pauses in speech. A father spoke of a daughter who had gone to work far away and never returned. A priest mentioned late nights when heavy objects were carried out of the castle. A former servant recalled areas of the castle they had been ordered never to enter. No one spoke plainly, but once recorded, these fragments began to assemble into a recognizable shape. Thurzo read each report with cold patience. He did not seek sensation. He sought a pattern, and the pattern was unmistakable. Lawful invitations, identical explanations, disappearances without trace. A system constructed with enough care to endure. That troubled him more than any tale of horror. He understood he could not act on rumor alone. Confronting Elizabeth Báthory required more than suspicion. It required proof. And proof in that world did not live on paper. It lived in testimony from those who survived. Thurzo ordered them to be found, knowing how difficult that would be. Anyone who survived had every reason to remain silent. And those who remain silent long enough often believe silence is the only way to stay alive. Gradually, testimonies emerged. A young girl who escaped the castle, carrying scars that could not be explained as accidents. A dismissed servant willing to speak in exchange for protection. Their accounts differed in detail, but matched in feeling, fear, surveillance, the sense of being reduced to a component of something nameless. Thurzo did not rush. He verified each statement, compared timelines, cross-checked locations. Independent stories began to align in ways too precise to be accidental. He realized he was not facing a series of spontaneous acts of violence, but a structure, and such a structure could only exist under the shelter of absolute power. The central issue was not whether Elizabeth was guilty. The issue was how to reach the truth without collapsing the order he was sworn to protect. A public arrest could turn Elizabeth into a symbol, or even a victim for those eager to exploit chaos. Thurzo knew this prey could not be cornered crudely. It had to be surrounded slowly. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued her public life as usual. There were no signs she knew the net was tightening around her, or if she did know, she gave no indication. The court in the shadows continued to function, but beyond the walls, another court had begun to move, silent, patient, and no less determined. Thurzo did not see himself as a hero. He did not think in terms of hunting a monster. In his mind, this was a case of power left unchecked, and his task was to diagnose it without killing the body of the kingdom. He knew that a single misstep could lead to irreversible consequences. The secret investigation stretched on long enough for Elizabeth to believe her system remained secure. But in the ever-thickening records on Thurzo's desk, a complete picture was forming. And when that picture became clear enough, the hunter understood it was time to step out of the shadows. Not to strike yet, but to appear. Sometimes appearance alone is enough to signal that the game is about to change. There was no explosive moment that marked the arrival of truth. No single confession, no lone witness standing up to reveal everything. Truth arrived differently. It accumulated, layer by layer, growing heavier until there was no soil left to bury it beneath. Testimonies were gathered over many months in many places from people who did not know one another. A surviving girl, her voice trembling but consistent, spoke of locked rooms and hours that never changed. A former servant, once trusted and later discarded, described orders given without explanation and punishment for anyone who dared to question them. A priest remembered far too many funeral prayers for young women, names that appeared and vanished from the records with unnatural speed. None of them described the entire picture, but they described the same structure, the same rhythm, the same sensation of being pulled into an order they had no power to escape. When Thurzo placed these testimonies side by side, the repeated details became impossible to deny. Night hours, areas of the castle, are strictly forbidden. Identical explanations are used to justify the disappearance. This was not the randomness of violence, it was the signature of a system carefully maintained. Certain details made him pause longer. Similar scars on different bodies. Descriptions of a voice that never shouted, never threatened, only commanded. These details were not dramatic, but their ordinariness made them terrifying. Violence, when it becomes routine, does not need spectacle. The full picture slowly emerged, and it spoke of more than crime. It spoke of power, of how a single individual could construct a closed world where external law no longer mattered. Elizabeth Báthory did not act in madness. She acted in clarity, with the patience of someone accustomed to controlling everything around her. That made the truth harder to accept, but also unmistakable. Thurzo understood there was no longer any reasonable doubt that could shield Elizabeth from the conclusion, but he also knew that his next move would shape how history remembered this entire affair. A reckless arrest could collapse everything he had built. A single misstep could turn the perpetrator into a victim in the public eye, drowning out the voices of those who had dared to speak. He spent many nights weighing not whether to act, but when and how. Every day of delay allowed the system to continue operating. Yet every hasty move risked destroying evidence and silencing witnesses forever. Truth once revealed cannot be buried again, but it can be distorted. In the end, what drove Thurzo to decide was not a new testimony, but the perfect alignment of all the old ones. No gaps remained. No space left for misunderstanding. Every path led to the same place, the same name. And the longer he delayed, the longer he allowed that name to continue masking reality. The decision was made in silence. No ceremony, no announcement. Thurzo ordered the assembly of a force large enough to prevent resistance, yet discreet enough to avoid panic. He chose a moment when the castle was least guarded, not for surprise, but for control. The objective was not a bloody confrontation. The objective was to end a system. Final orders were issued in language that was cold and precise. No one was to act beyond instruction. No one was to pass judgment independently. Elizabeth Báthory was not to be considered guilty before the truth was placed fully in the light. But that light Thurzo knew would show no mercy. When everything was ready, he stood alone before the completed picture. It was no longer a collection of fragmented stories. It was the map of a deliberately constructed hell. And once that map was seen, he no longer had the right to turn away. The truth had crossed the point of burial. And when that happens, the keeper of order has no choice but to step out of the shadows, carrying the authority of the crown and the weight of history to knock on a door no one had dared to knock on for far too long. There was no moon that night. Winter smothered Cachtice beneath a silence as thick as cold ash, and old snow cracked beneath the soldiers' boots as they advanced up the familiar slope. There were no horns, no shouted commands, only breath condensing in the frozen air, and torches carefully shielded, bright enough to guide their steps, dim enough not to warn. Georgi Thurzo walked at the front, his cloak heavy, his face stripped of expression save for absolute focus. He had not come to conquer. He had come to the end of something. The great gate of the castle was not knocked upon. It was forced open. Ancient wood-grown metal tore loose from its joints, and for a brief moment the sound spread like a fracture through the night. But there was no alarm, no chaos. Only figures split into corridors, like water flowing around stone, following routes mapped from testimony and memory. Everything happened too quickly for fear to fully form. Inside, the air was colder than outside, not from wind, but from the absence of life. Long corridors, damp stone walls, torchlight casting warped shadows that crawled along ceilings. The first smell they noticed was not blood. It was old metal mixed with rot, the odor of rooms without windows, places where time had been sealed in and left to decay slowly. They found the descent not by map, but by trained instinct. A thick door set slightly off the main corridor, undecorated, unmarked. When it opened, air surged upward like a frozen breath. Stone steps led down, each worn smooth and slick, as if long accustomed to bodies being dragged rather than feet walking willingly. The dungeon was not a single chamber. It was a network. Small cells, iron fastenings, corners where torchlight reached and then retreated. Here, there was no theatrical display of evil. There were signs of repetition. Chains hung at identical heights. Hooks are placed in the same positions. Stone floors were scrubbed too clean where no cleanliness was needed. This was the language of a process. Then they heard a sound, not screaming, just a faint scraping like fingernails brushing stone. One soldier stopped, raised a hand. When they reached the deepest cell, torchlight revealed faces, no longer strong enough to react. Girls in chains so thin their clothing hung on them like borrowed fabric. Their eyes were open, but they did not search for rescue. They merely registered the change in light like creatures long conditioned to believe that nothing carried meaning anymore. This was living proof, no explanation required, no verdict necessary. Their presence alone shattered every remaining doubt. Thurzo stood still for a long moment, looking at each face as if carving them into memory. He did not turn away. He knew he had to carry these images with him, because truths not faced directly are easily twisted later. Above the castle maintained its daytime order. The great dining hall was lit. The long table was set, as if awaiting a late meal. Elizabeth Báthory was found there, seated upright, dressed in dark fabric, her hair carefully arranged. When Thurzo entered, she did not rise. She did not retreat. She looked at him as one looks at a breach of protocol. There was no moment of realization, no panic, only pure indignation. Elizabeth did not ask why. Her eyes asked by what right. It was the gaze of someone who had lived too long in a world where that question never required an answer. Thurzo did not read charges. He did not need to. The sounds from below, the hurried footsteps of soldiers, bringing survivors up the cold air rising from the stairwell, spoke clearly enough. Elizabeth understood, not with collapse, but with rigidity. Her jaw tightened. Her anger was not directed at victims, nor at traitors. It was directed at this moment, the moment absolute power was violated. She finally spoke, her voice neither raised nor lowered. No pleading, no denial. She spoke of honor, of lineage, of an order that existed before him and would endure after he left. It was not a defense. It was an accusation turned outward, as if the investigation itself were the greater offense. Thurzo listened, then ended the exchange with silence. He did not argue. He did not persuade. He simply stated that the authority of the crown had arrived, and from this moment on, Elizabeth Báthory was no longer the sole master of this castle. The words were not dramatic, but they carried the weight of stone. For a brief instant, two worlds faced one another. On one side, the old order maintained by fear and habit. On the other hand, an order struggling to protect itself from the monsters it had long tolerated. Elizabeth did not tremble. She did not cry. She stared straight ahead, as if carving this image into Thurzo, so he would remember that there was once a time when she needed permission from no one. That night the castle was thrown open, not only gates and doors, but the thick layers of silence that had covered it for years. When the imprisoned were brought into the light, when chains fell onto stone, when corridors first echoed with footsteps not born of submission, Cachtice ceased to be an untouchable fortress. It became a witness. Elizabeth Báthory was surrounded not by blades, but by truth finally risen from the earth. And in the flickering torchlight of the winter night, the most terrifying thing was not what had been found in the dungeon, but the face of the one who had created it. Still proud, still furious, still convinced that the world was wrong to dare cross her threshold. The trial took place in a cold, great hall, where walls of thick stone swallowed sound before it could travel far. The air was heavy with candle wax and old metal, as if the room itself was accustomed to witnessing confessions never fully spoken. The hall was crowded, yet no one mistook this for a trial devoted to pure truth. This was a political ritual, and everyone present understood their role within it. Those brought before justice were not the architects of hell. They were its operators. The servants who once moved through the shadows of Cachtice Castle now stood beneath harsh light hands, bound faces hollowed by sleeplessness and fear. Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Jo, Janos Ujvari, and others no longer carried the borrowed authority they once wielded. They looked like fragments left behind after a larger machine had come to a halt. Testimonies were read aloud, layered methodical cold. The catalogue of acts required no explicit detail to leave the hall breathless. The repetition of patterns of orders, given without question of nights unfolding identically, revealed evil not as madness but as routine. The accused avoided the eyes of those listening because they knew every gaze was searching for the same thing, a name, but that name did not sit in the dock. Elizabeth Báthory was absent. Her absence required no lengthy explanation. It was accepted as a fact of life, like the arrival of winter or the way power bends law. No one asked why the figure named in every testimony was not present. The question existed, but it hovered in the air, forbidden to land upon the table of judgment. That absence created a hollow chill. a space no one dared look directly into. Justice in this moment did not face the center of the crime. It moved around it. It chose safer targets, those without powerful families behind them, those who could be sacrificed without triggering political shockwaves. Power did not need to appear in person to shield itself. It manifested in the judge's measured tones, in the careful choice of words that never crossed an invisible boundary. Elizabeth was not called the accused. She was referred to as a party of interest, a minor distinction on paper, enough to alter the fate of an entire trial. The servants, realizing this, began to break. Some wept. Some shouted that they had only followed orders. Others tried to shift blame onto one another as if redirecting responsibility might open a narrow escape. But the more they spoke, the tighter they bound themselves to the larger picture. Every confession intended to save the self instead reinforced the presence of an invisible yet undeniable center of power. Sentences were delivered swiftly, almost hurriedly. They were exemplary, performative, decisive. Some were condemned to death by brutal means, befitting the age and the desire to declare that justice had been done. Others received lesser punishments, still severe enough to ensure their lives would end in darkness. The crowd did not cheer. No one felt complete satisfaction, because everyone knew this was only part of the story. Elizabeth Báthory, meanwhile, remained within her castle, unshackled, unparaded before the crowd. She was protected by the very fear her name inspired. Lineage, honor, and the dread of a scandal larger than any single crime formed an invisible wall, halting justice one step short. The final decision was made behind closed doors, neither acquittal nor public trial, a sentence unlike any other, born of compromise between morality and politics. Elizabeth would not appear before the court. She would not be permitted to leave the castle, a confinement without bars, yet without freedom. Justice that night wore a compromised, shadowed face. It lacked the courage to name the full truth, yet was not weak enough to ignore it entirely. It chose the middle path, where crime was acknowledged in part and power preserved in part. In the darkness of the great hall, as the condemned were led away, an unease lingered, not because the punishments were too harsh, but because they were not enough. The monster had been exposed, but not fully brought into the light. And when justice is not meant for all, it leaves behind a chill deeper than any scream, a whisper that some doors, even after being flung open on a winter night, can still be closed again by power allowing darkness to persist merely in another form. The sentence was not announced with trumpets. It was not read aloud before a crowd. It was carried out with hammers, mortar, and stone in the absolute silence of power, determined to erase its own traces. Elizabeth Báthory was not dragged from the castle. She did not depart in disgrace. On the contrary, she was kept like a secret meant to be buried deep, not in the ground, but inside the very walls that had once protected her. The chosen chamber lay at the highest point of the tower, where winter winds never ceased and light was already scarce. This was no accident. It was the place farthest from the daily life of the castle, far from footsteps, far from conversation, far from any sign the world was continuing. The masons arrived on a gray morning, carrying stone mortar and orders that required no explanation. Elizabeth stood there back straight, watching them work, without speaking a word. There was no door, no exit, only a narrow opening, just wide enough to slide food through, set at chest height, a bitter reminder that her survival now depended entirely on others. When the final stone was set in place, light disappeared. Not the darkness of night, but absolute darkness, without depth, without movement, without time. No mirror. That detail was not accidental. They understood the obsession that had once ruled Elizabeth. They removed the last object that allowed her to control her own image. No reflection, no face to confront. In that darkness, she could not know whether she was aging or still holding the appearance she once equated with power. Time, her greatest enemy, no longer needed to prove its existence. It was present in every breath. No power, no commands. No one knelt. No one answered. The thick walls absorbed all sound, rendering any voice meaningless. Elizabeth, who had once decided the fate of others with a glance, could no longer decide even when light would return. She was stripped not only of freedom, but of the role she had lived inside for her entire life. Day and night merged into one. Food arrived without fixed hours, as if to emphasize that the old order had been erased. No one spoke to her. No one explained anything. The guards performed their duty, precisely, no more, no less. To them, she was no longer a countess. She was a silent obligation. What happens inside the mind of a person sealed in complete darkness, without mirrors, without voices, without any reflection of the outside world, is something no one can know for certain. Perhaps Elizabeth relived old memories, not as a victim, but as a cold observer. Perhaps she felt no guilt, only betrayal. Perhaps even in that darkness, she still believed the world was wrong to dare strip her of power. There is no record of remorse, no account of screams or pleas. What remains is only prolonged silence, a silence so heavy it became the true punishment. Not physical pain, not an immediate death, but an existence drained of meaning day after day. Elizabeth Báthory died in that room at a time never precisely recorded. When a guard brought food and received no response, the wall was broken open just as it had once been built. Light flooded the dark chamber for the first time in years, falling upon a body already cold. There was no ceremony, no burial befitting her lineage, only a quiet ending fitting the sentence chosen for her. Cachtice Castle remained standing after Elizabeth's death. Its walls still rose firm. Its corridors still echoed with the wind. But from that moment on, it carried an additional layer of memory. Not only a place of power or crime, but a place where a person who believed herself untouchable was erased from the world. Stone by stone, the story does not close with satisfaction. It leaves behind a void, like that dark room without a mirror. A question without a clear answer. Was Elizabeth Báthory a monster born of her own cruelty, or an inevitable product of unchecked power and collective silence? Had she not carried the Báthory name, would justice have acted differently? And more disturbingly, in our world today, how many dark rooms without mirrors still exist? Places where truth is sealed away, waiting until there is no one left inside to speak.